Hello you awesome guys and girls, I'm Anthony aka Mad Wizard and welcome back to another episode of BarCraft for your nerdy cocktail needs. Old and new viewers alike, I would like to say welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you here as always. So, the more eagle-eyed viewer amongst you might see we're in different surroundings today. Well, there's a very good reason for that. So, whether if you're watching this now or sometime in the future, currently we are going through the COVID-19 outbreak, so a lot of people, including members of my own family, are currently having to self-isolate at the moment and use social distancing, not just here in Britain but obviously across all over the world. Basically me and the team here at Renegade Revolutions, we've decided that we are going to try and keep our distance away until further notice. I mean, obviously we're still communicating through social media and other platforms, but obviously until things start quietening down, we're going to obviously keep our distance away from each other. That obviously includes members of our own family as well. But that doesn't mean that we are not going to be able to bring you content. As I say, what we've decided to do is that I'm going to be filming some episodes of BarCraft here in my own home, and as I say, the idea of BarCraft essentially was so that you guys, the viewers, can actually mix these cocktails along with us at home. So as I say, you might not always have all of the ingredients, or you might not always have all of the equipment to hand, so I want to show you that you can still enjoy cocktails. And as I say, if you are currently self-isolating, that as I say, you can still do all these things. I just want to say as well that all of the doctors and nurses, not just here in Britain but across the world, as I say, you're doing an absolute fantastic job. And as I say, for you viewers at home, as I say, please stay at home, please stay safe, stay isolated. As I say, we can beat this COVID-19 together if we all work together. As I say, if you do have to go out and get necessities, please show good hygiene, good cleanliness, obviously keep social distancing, which is obviously 2 meters or just over 6 feet away from any individuals, and obviously limit any sort of contact that you can between not just your friends but your family as well. We still want to bring you great content. As I say, like, you know, we're still running the Twitch stream, so as I say, if you're interested in coming watching us play some games of the evening, GMT time, as I say, all descriptions or links to the Twitch channel will be in the description boxes below. So anyway, what are we going to do today? So I've been having a think about all of the cocktails. So if you've watched our previous videos, and if you haven't watched our previous videos, go back and watch them. They're really good. So you've been seeing us making lots of nerdy cocktails and lots of many concoctions over this time. But I thought it would be nice to actually go back to where cocktails first began, like, you know, classic cocktails. Like, so if you go to a cocktail bar, they always have the good old classic cocktails on there. So you've got your old fashions, your Sazeracs, your screwdrivers, your Manhattans, all of those sort of things. And I thought it'd be quite nice to actually revisit those, find out why they're called classics, why they're, you know, steeped in history as they are, and obviously the brief history of the drinks and just mixology itself. As I say, it's very steeped in history. As I say, if you want to find out more, there's many good websites and books available out there in the ether that I can recommend to people. But as I say, today will be sort of a brief sort of summary of basically where cocktails essentially came from, and we shall be concocting today one of the first cocktails, or a variation of one of the first cocktails that we know today, which is the old-fashioned. And if you want to know why it's called an old-fashioned, we shall get to that very shortly. So, cocktails. what are they? Where did they come from? And how long have cocktails been around? Essentially, cocktails have been around since people have started drinking, really. As I say, alcohol, like, believe it or not, the first records of alcohol actually being around, believe it or not, was from the bees. Like, bees have been fermenting, essentially, when they go and collect nectar. And then obviously they use their saliva and stuff like that to ferment out into honey. As I say, if they leave that for long enough, obviously it gets turned into mead, which is what the Vikings drank. And also we have records of even the Egyptians drinking mead as well. Like, you know, that was the first essential alcoholic beverage, just from natural sugars that the bees would excrete through their saliva, and the nectar being mixed together, and then wild yeast in the air, as I say, fermenting the sugars, and over time, and then the bees used to drink that. But then humans came along and they were able to sort of recreate that in sort of like terracotta vessels and stuff like that, and essentially that's how alcohol came about. Essentially, it's just the fermentation of sugary water with wild yeast, which is everywhere. And that's kind of where it came from. But mixology itself, like, you know, mixing cocktails with different things, that goes back to sort of around Egypt and Turkey as well. As I say, archaeologists, when they were sort of analysing the different vessels that were in tombs, essentially, when they found out sort of like, oh, what's this vase, what's this in here, as an offering, they found there was it was a combination of like wines and mead and sort of other sort of barley wine or barley beer-esque sort of liquids, all mixed together with a lot of herbs and spices. So that was essentially one of the first cocktails, or what would be classified as a sort of like a mixed spirit, essentially. But cocktails of what we know today didn't really come in until sort of like around the 16th century, where actual distilled spirits actually came from. So you would get sort of grain spirits or sugarcane spirits, which would then obviously go on to make rum, or you've got barley spirits, which would then go on to make sort of like whiskey and gin and that sort of thing. Popular drink of the time was actually punch, or at least this is where we have the first records of sort of mixed drinks together. Because essentially when they distilled the spirits, it was essentially just like pure ethanol, essentially, and because it was so strong, they didn't know the they didn't have the knowledge that obviously if you ferment, like let it sit in barrels, that it would weaken and then you can drink it, blah blah blah. And obviously, so they would add things to it. So they would add sugar and water and other citrus spirits to it in order to basically make it drinkable. Essentially, they'd have cordials and stuff like that. And it was mainly for sort of like high society, aristocratic sort of thing, like, you know, people that could afford sugar to be imported and citrus fruits and stuff like that. And that was sort of like the main drink of the time. I mean, it wasn't until sort of like the 17th century that sort of naval men, obviously they would be going out on long journeys at sea, and rum was a ration, a ration, or part of their rationing. And believe it or not, the UK Navy, sort of like it was a provision for the Navy. It was for them to have rum right up until the 1970s, if you can believe that. Like, you know, they were still issued rum as part of their provisions. And it was still a provision back in the 17th century as well. So this is where you would get variations on what we would know today as grog, which is a variation of the punch. There we go, sorry. I've not had enough drinks. So basically it would be a variation of punch, which was grog, which essentially was the same thing. It was basically rum with sugar, water and citrus fruit, and the citrus fruit was added to prevent scurvy, as you know. So basically they believed that the rum was medicinal, that it would basically cleanse you and like kill any sort of bacteria from the inside, and that the citrus fruit would help prevent scurvy, and but obviously the sugar was there, and they ate quite a lot of sugar back then. It was a rarity to have this sweet commodity, essentially, like, you know. So if you look through recipes back from sort of like the 17th and the 18th century, like, you know, there was just like pounds and pounds of sugar in like literally everything. So they were probably on like a constant sugar high, you know. So they probably had like the equivalent of today of having sort of like several Monster Energy drinks or something like that. That was them, like 24/7. So what they would do is the naval men, they would have their grog, and basically then what they would do is that the officers, they would go back and they would recreate those drinks for sort of like their friends of high society and stuff like that. It's like, oh, this is what my navalmen drink, like, you know, when we're on long journeys and that, and they would try it and they were like, oh, this is actually really, really nice. And they would have variations of that. They would have obviously the money to afford more luxury ingredients, so I mean they would like, oh, maybe we can mix a bit of this and mix a bit of that together, and that's essentially where they started sort of like mixing more sort of luxurious, or at the time luxurious, sort of ingredients together. So moving into the 18th century, sort of around the sort of time of the American Revolution, there was a popular drink known as swing that they used to drink quite a lot of, which essentially was based upon the original punch and grog recipes that there were. And essentially it was a distilled spirit mixed with sugar and water, and they would drink that. And but what would happen is because they were still learning about distillation essentially, and obviously if you distill spirits, you don't just get ethanol, which is our main drink. So you'd get things like ethanol, methanol, and acetone, which obviously the methanol and the acetone would give you like basically a pounding headache. So what they used to do, or what they decided to do, is if I just grab the bottle here, they added something called Angostura bitters, which this was very popular at the time. They used to add this to literally everything. It's basically like the lean pairings for cocktails. And if you're wondering why the label essentially is bigger than the bottle, the myth goes that essentially, I think that there was two people that were running the business. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, but essentially one went out and bought the bottles, one went out and bought the labels, and then when they came together, obviously they didn't fit. But obviously they didn't have the money in order to fix one or the other problem, so basically they just said, stuff it, we'll put it on there, and we'll see what happens. And it's just been a marketing gimmick ever since. So what they would do is that they would add a couple of Angostura bitters or aroma bitters to their swing cocktails in order for it to become a bit more medicinal, so they would say. So basically, if you woke up in the morning and you'd have a hangover, by adding the bitters in order to the drink, and then you would drink that, it would basically cure your hangover, which is where we get hair of the dog from today. Another sort of introduction around this sort of time was ice. Ice was a very, very big commodity back then. As I say, obviously it wasn't that easily obtainable to get ice, especially obviously in the summer months. So what they would do is during the winter time, they would go out into the lakes, and that they would cut like massive, huge blocks of ice, and then they would take that to insulated warehouses, and literally they would sell that all over America. during the summertime, and that they would obviously put that in their drinks. So, sort of moving on from that, it's this is basically when a lot of these old Navy men they gave up, obviously travelling the sea and travelling and stuff like that, and they wanted to settle down for a bit. So basically a lot of these sailors, essentially they would open up these bars or taverns and stuff like that, and a lot of the recipes that came out from sort of like the grog days, and obviously the punch days, and obviously the swing now, they would basically mix all of these different things together, which was the start essentially of the modern sort of cocktail bar that we know today. There was many variations of cocktails, obviously the introduction to obviously like fizzy water, so they would add things like that, so so you get like sparkling cocktails and stuff like that would have bitters to there. You'd have gin, you'd have rum, you'd have whiskey, that sort of thing. So that they would mix all of these things together. And another great ingredient as well was the vermouth. So obviously you get sort of like sweet vermouth, dry vermouth, and literally different variations of these spirits mixed with vermouth and bitters and stuff like that. You would get a whole multitude of different cocktails, essentially like the old fashioned, the Sazerac, the Manhattan, essentially like, just mixing the ingredients in different ratios. You would essentially, but they all use essentially all of the same ingredients. So there was that sort of mixology there. Obviously moving on from that, you got Prohibition, as I say, in the 1920s, I believe. So obviously a lot of people, they couldn't get their cocktails anymore. So what they would do is, you've probably heard of something called rye whiskey, which is obviously a grain that's all they could get back in the day. Obviously bourbons over stateside, they're made from corn, whilst ones over in sort of like Scotland and Ireland and that, they're made with barley or malt, or sort of this is where you get sort of like scotches and sort of like single malt whiskies and stuff like that. But over in America they use corn, so like this is where you get bourbon, like corn mash and sour mash whiskies and stuff like that. But obviously back in the 1920s, obviously any sort of corn production and stuff like that, obviously it was very, very hard, but they were able to get their hands on rye, so they had rye, and they would basically get the sugars from the rye and make whiskey from that, which is why today a lot of rye whiskies are known as sort of like Prohibition whiskey and stuff like that. Completely different sort of flavour profiles and stuff like that, a lot more sour, a lot more harsher and stuff like that, but still very, very good if you can actually pick yourself up a really nice one. So during this time period, if someone wanted to come in and wanted essentially a swing, they basically called it essentially an old-fashioned, because as the name implies, is that it was an old-fashioned way of making cocktails, back literally from just distilled spirit, sugar and bitters, essentially, just mixed over ice. So the swing essentially just became the old-fashioned, because as I say, it was a old-fashioned way of making cocktails, essentially, or one of the first. So that essentially is a brief history of cocktails, and like literally nowadays there are massive, huge books filled with cocktails. For example, this is my one here, this is my cocktail book, and literally you can see how thick that is, and it is just literally jam-packed full of cocktails. All very, very nice, all sort of worth trying. But yes, I say literally from just people experimenting, mixology has exploded into the culture that it is today. So that is a brief history of essentially where cocktails come from. I hope you enjoyed that. But to finish off, we are going to create the old-fashioned, or aka the swing. So I'll show you how to make an old-fashioned cocktail. So for this we need 3 ingredients, possibly a 4th one, but as I say, it's more of an optional ingredient. So this is what you'll need: a bourbon whiskey of your choice, Angostura bitters, a sugar of your choosing. Now normally back in the day they would actually use a sugar cube, and what you would do with the sugar cube is that you'd actually drop the Angostura bitters onto the sugar cube, and then from the whiskey that you pour into it, that you would actually mix that with the ice that would distill it and actually dissolve the sugar. But today we're using maple syrup, essentially because that's what I have to hand. I prefer maple syrup in my old-fashioned. So essentially this is called a maple old-fashioned, but this is a variation. And as an optional ingredient, we're also going to add a bit of Cointreau. Now normally what you would do is that you would add a orange peel wedge to the drink itself. So basically the essential oils from the orange rind, that you would actually squeeze that into the drink, and that would sort of flavour it. But because I don't essentially have any oranges to hand right now, but I do have Cointreau, I'm just going to add a little bit of that to the mix. So to make a maple old-fashioned, you'll need 2 shots of bourbon, half a shot of maple syrup, two dashes of Angostura bitters, and for my version I'm adding just a quarter or half a shot of Cointreau, which is orange flavoured liqueur. Stir it up. And there you go. So there you go, you awesome guys and girls, the old-fashioned. Cheers. Oh, it smells so good. Ah, classic. That is a really, really nice cocktail. So if you're a big whiskey or bourbon drinker, I would highly recommend this cocktail. Just on the nose you get obviously that classic sort of ethanol taste, but you get that beautiful rich sweet vanilla charred oak sort of smell and flavour coming from the whiskey and the bourbon. There's a beautiful nutty sweet note from the maple syrup. The Angostura bitters just gives it that nice level of herbs and spice which you want. I mean, there's a slight sour note on the side of the tongue. I did use a sour whiskey as well, so that's probably contributing to that. And then you just got this beautiful after citrus notes from the Cointreau. It is just a wonderful evening sipper. You can dress this up with a Muscovado cherry in here, but I don't have any, to be honest with you. And ideally you are supposed to dilute this with a bit of water. I could probably see just adding a little bit of water to this, or a bit of ice, probably would bring out the flavour profiles a lot more. You probably get a lot more drink for your money as well. So but it's so balanced, it's beautiful. It's just everything I look for in a drink, you know. It's sort of like, it's sweet, it's sour, it's bitter, it's got herbs, it's got spice, you know, it's got citrus, it's just got everything. And you can see why it's such a classic, you know. If I went into a cocktail bar and they gave me one of these, I would be more than happy sipping this all night, or just simply just curled up on the sofa watching Netflix with one of these drinks. Yeah, more than happy, more than happy. Definitely give that a go if you get the opportunity to. It is an absolute fantastic drink. So, hope you enjoyed the video, guys. As I say, it's a bit weird circumstances under the moment, but as I say, we're all doing our best, not just here in Britain, but up and down the country and across the world. Yet again, as I say, please do stay safe out there. Please exercise. As I say, sort of like social distancing, and obviously self-hygiene, like, you know, wash your hands, use hand sanitizer, like, you know, be safe, stay at home, self-isolate, don't interact with people if you can help it, and only just go out for pure necessity reasons. But yes, I say, hope you enjoyed the video. As I say, if you have any ideas for future videos or future cocktails, I mean, if you've enjoyed this sort of historical side of things, as I say, chuck a like in the video box below, or if you have any ideas on future cocktails that you'd like a bit more information on, as I say, we can go more in depth with those. I can do some research and I can bring them to you, and as I say, we can sit and have a drink together. As I say, don't forget to share, like and subscribe if you've enjoyed it, and of course all of us over at Renegade Revolutions, yet again, as I say, I hope you stay safe and everything, and I hope to see you on the next one. So until then, drink responsibly, stay safe, and cheers. Bye. That's a fine good cocktail.